At 6:15 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander James Thach sat in the cockpit of his fighter, 20,000 feet above the Pacific, watching a swarm of black dots grow larger and more deadly by the second. He was leading 6 fighters from the carrier USS Yorktown, assigned to protect a group of torpedo bombers heading toward the Japanese fleet during the Battle of Midway. The air was thin and cold. Thach was sweating. He knew exactly what those black specks were. Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, the most lethal dogfighters in the sky. Within seconds, they would dive. And when they did, it would be like wolves descending on wounded prey. Thach tightened his grip on the controls of his Grumman F4F Wildcat, an aircraft that felt less like a sleek fighter and more like a flying truck. He watched the Zeros roll inverted and drop, their movements fluid and effortless, as if gravity worked for them. He glanced at his own wings, thick, square, stubby. If he tried to fight them on their terms, he already knew the outcome. To understand why Thach was sweating, you have to understand the brutal math of 1942. The Pacific War was not an even contest. Early on, it was a massacre. The Japanese Navy had spent years perfecting the Zero. It was built from an advanced aluminum alloy that made it extraordinarily light without sacrificing structural integrity. Engineers stripped away everything non-essential. No heavy armor behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal protective systems. The result was breathtaking. The Zero could turn tighter than anything in the American arsenal. Climbed faster. It rolled smoother. In a turning fight, it was unbeatable. If a U.S. pilot tried to outturn a Zero, the Japanese fighter would simply cut inside the arc, slide onto his tail, and fire its 20mm cannons into the cockpit. It was like dueling a fencer while wearing medieval armor. Across from this aerial acrobat stood the American answer, the Wildcat. If the Zero was a sports car, the Wildcat was industrial machinery. Built by Grumman, a company famous for rugged construction, the F4F was short, thick, and heavy. Its fuselage resembled a steel barrel. Its wings were broad and reinforced. It was so mechanically simple that the landing gear had to be cranked up by hand, 30 turns of a wheel in the cockpit after takeoff. Pilots called it the tub. They called it the peanut. It was slower than the Zero, climbed worse, and in a classic dogfight where turning meant survival, it simply could not compete. Military experts in Washington looked at the specifications and saw a disaster. They criticized its weight, its armor, its self-sealing fuel tanks. Too heavy, too cautious, too slow. Japanese pilots mocked it as well. In their combat reports, they described American formations as easy prey. They would circle, tease, and then slice through them. The worst part was the doctrine. Navy manuals still encouraged pilots to dogfight, to mix it up individually, to rely on personal skill to outmaneuver the enemy. Against the Zero, that advice was lethal. Every time an American pilot tried to turn inside one, the Wildcat would shudder toward a stall, while the lighter Zero floated effortlessly around the arc and fired. By mid-1942, morale was collapsing. Pilots aboard the USS Enterprise and Yorktown walked to their planes with the expressions of men heading toward execution. They believed they had been sent into modern air combat with outdated equipment. But Jimmy Thach saw something different. He was not just a stick-and-rudder pilot. He was a tactician. At night, he lay awake replaying engagements in his head. He knew the Wildcat could not turn with a Zero, so he stopped trying to make it something it wasn't. Fully loaded, the Wildcat weighed nearly 8,000 pounds, roughly twice the weight of a Zero. Most considered that a crippling disadvantage. Thach began to wonder if it was an opportunity. Heavy things fall faster. Point a heavy object straight down, and gravity does not resist. It accelerates. Momentum builds. Speed compounds. A stone drops like a bullet. A feather floats. The Wildcat, with its reinforced wings and armored structure, could withstand forces that might tear apart a lighter aircraft. Its thick frame could absorb punishment. It wasn't a duelist. It was an anvil. And while an anvil is terrible at dancing, it is devastating when falling. Thach developed a radical idea. Stop trying to outturn the Zero. Stop fighting its strengths. Instead, dive. If a Zero latched onto his tail, instead of pulling back on the stick, the instinctive move, he would push forward. Hard. He would aim straight at the ocean and let gravity do the fighting. The heavier Wildcat would accelerate in a steep dive, building speed the lighter Zero could not safely match without risking structural failure. The Zero's delicate construction, so perfect for turning, made it vulnerable at high-speed dives. Thach wasn't planning to run. He was planning to weaponize weight. Now, as the Zeros began their dive at Midway, he tightened his grip on the stick. This time, he wasn't going to play their game. The fatal threat was closing fast. Japanese tracers were already reaching toward his fuel tanks, glowing red against the blue Pacific sky. The old James Thach would have banked hard left or right, trying to jink and dodge. The new Thach didn't flinch. He keyed his radio. His voice was calm, almost clinical, despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. He was about to break the rules. He was about to prove that a flying brick could kill a race car if you threw it hard enough. He watched the lead Mitsubishi A6M Zero settle into firing position behind his Grumman F4F Wildcat, and he smiled. It was time to show them what a beer barrel could do when you let it fall. The matchsticks on the table. While other Navy pilots wrote letters home and cursed the tub, Thach had been sitting at his kitchen table in San Diego months earlier, pushing wooden matches across an oilcloth table. Each matchstick was a fighter. Every time he simulated a turning fight, the American match died. He knew the manual was a death sentence. If a Wildcat tried to turn with a Zero, it lost. Every time. So he stopped thinking about turning radius. He started thinking about weight. The Wildcat weighed nearly 5 tons. The Zero weighed roughly half that. The experts saw that as a curse. Sluggish climb, heavy controls, slow acceleration. Thach saw stored energy. The Wildcat wasn't just a fighter. It was potential energy waiting for gravity to pull the trigger. The Zero achieved its agility by stripping away everything: armor, heavy fuel protection, structural redundancy. Its long, elegant wings and light frame made it dance. But dancing machines don't like hurricanes. The Wildcat, built by Grumman, was the opposite. Thick wings, reinforced spars, armor plate behind the pilot, hydraulic-assisted controls. It was industrial, brutal. Kite flutters. A bowling ball screams. Thach realized the solution wasn't to outfly the Zero. It was to outfall it. He called it, informally, a terminal velocity trap. Power dive. When Thach presented the idea to his squadron, the ready room fell silent. He didn't teach them a tighter turn. He told them to run. If a Zero got on your tail, don't turn. Don't pull back. Shove the throttle to the firewall. Roll inverted. Dive straight at the ocean. In flight school, altitude was life. Giving it up felt like surrender. Diving away was something cowards did. The pilots argued. The Zero was faster. Diving would just make them easier targets. Thach shook his head. Speed isn't just horsepower. It's mass. In a steep dive, gravity accelerates heavy objects faster. The Wildcat would build momentum like a falling safe. The lighter Zero, with its wide, thin wings, would have to force its way down under engine power. But the trap had a second, darker layer. Hold the dive, Thach told them. Past 350 miles per hour. At those speeds, air stops behaving like air. It behaves like concrete. This is compressibility, where control surfaces stiffen, airflow changes, and the airplane resists the pilot. The Wildcat's thick wings and rugged structure could endure it. It would shake violently, but it would hold. The Zero's long, elegant wings would become liabilities. The higher the speed, the greater the aerodynamic loads twisting at the tips. The lighter structure that made it unbeatable in a turn could become fragile in a high-speed pullout. If a Japanese pilot followed too deep into the dive, physics would decide the outcome. It was a duel fought not with maneuvering, but with gravity. Trial by ocean. The first real test came during fighting in the Coral Sea Theater. For Wildcats were jumped by Zeros from high astern, the classic Japanese attack profile. The American lead pilot fought instinct. He didn't turn. Power dive, he shouted. All 4 Wildcats rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean. The Zeros followed immediately, confident and aggressive. They assumed the Americans were fleeing. At 15,000 feet, the chase began. By 10,000 feet, the Wildcats were past 300 miles per hour, accelerating hard. At 5,000 feet, the needles were pushing beyond 400 miles per hour. The American pilots were wrestling their controls. The air hammered against their wings. The aircraft shook so violently the instrument panels blurred. But the airframes held. Behind them, the Zeros were entering dangerous territory. The airflow stiffened their controls. The long wings flexed under enormous stress. At 2,000 feet, the American leader called it, "Pull out." The Wildcats groaned as their pilots hauled back with both hands. G-forces crushed them into their seats. Vision narrowed. Blood drained from their heads. The stubby wings bit into the air. The noses rose. They leveled just above the Whitecaps, engines roaring. Behind them, 1-0 tried to pull out too late. There was no explosion, just a violent structural failure. The wing twisted beyond its limits and tore free. The aircraft snapped into the sea in a plume of white spray. Another 0 overcorrected. The strain tore control surfaces loose, cartwheeled into the water. The remaining Japanese pilots broke off, stunned. They had chased a tub into a dive, and their own aircraft had come apart. The shift. Back aboard the carrier, something changed. The ready room no longer felt like a waiting room for execution. The pilots stopped cursing their heavy fighters. They ran their hands across the thick aluminum skin of their Wildcats with new respect. The weight wasn't a curse. It was armor. It was momentum. It was survival. The Wildcat wasn't built to dance. It was built to endure. And in the Pacific sky of 1942, endurance was becoming deadlier than elegance. The immediate fatal threat was closing in. Japanese tracers were already reaching out, hunting for his fuel tanks. The old Jimmy Thach would have banked left, trying to dodge. The new Jimmy Thach didn't flinch. He keyed his radio, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. He was about to break the rules. He was about to prove that a flying brick could kill a race car if you just threw it hard enough. He watched the lead 0 line up for the kill and he smiled. It was time to show them what a beer barrel could do when you let it fall. While the rest of the Navy was busy writing wills and complaining about the tub, Jimmy Thach was sitting at his kitchen table in San Diego, staring at a box of wooden matches. He pushed the matchsticks across the oilcloth, simulating dogfights. He knew the standard rulebook was a suicide pact. If a Wildcat tried to turn with a 0, the matchstick representing the American plane always ended up dead. But Thach wasn't studying turning radius anymore. He was thinking about the one thing the Wildcat had that the 0 didn't: mass. The experts saw the Wildcat's 5-ton weight as a curse. It made the plane sluggish in a climb and heavy on the controls. But Thach began to see it differently, as a reservoir of potential energy. He realized the beer barrel wasn't just a fighter plane. It was a kinetic weapon waiting for gravity to pull the trigger. The revelation came from understanding the enemy's strength, which was also its greatest weakness. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was built for agility. To achieve that agility, its designers shaved off every unnecessary ounce. The wings were long and thin to grip the air. The skin was paper-thin aluminum. It was like a kite, magnificent in a breeze, fragile in a storm. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was the opposite. It was a bowling ball. And Thach knew that if you drop a kite and a bowling ball off a roof, the kite flutters, but the bowling ball screams. He realized the only way to beat the Japanese was to stop flying and start falling. He called it the terminal velocity trap. Thach gathered his squadron in the ready room, young pilots already shaken by reports coming out of the Coral Sea. They expected a clever turning maneuver, some secret trick to slip inside a Zero's guard. Instead, Thach told them to do the one thing every instinct screamed against: run. When a 0 got on their tail, he said, "Don't turn. Don't yank back on the stick. Shove the throttle to the firewall. Roll inverted. Dive straight for the ocean." The room went silent. In flight school, they had been taught that altitude was life. Giving up altitude meant surrendering advantage. Diving away was what cowards did to escape, not what fighters did to win. They argued the 0 was faster. Diving would only make them easier targets. Thach shook his head. Speed wasn't just about horsepower. It was about weight. In a steep dive, the heavy Wildcat would accelerate faster than the lightweight 0. It would drop like a safe, The Zero, with its wide, light wings, would float. It would have to force itself downward under engine power, while the Wildcat simply let gravity take control. But the plan had a darker second act. The dive wasn't just an escape, it was a weapon. Hold it until the airspeed passes 350 miles per hour, Thach instructed. At that speed, air stops behaving like air and starts behaving like concrete. Pushes back against the controls. This is compressibility. The Wildcat, with its thick hydraulic-assisted controls and short, stiff wings, could endure it. It would shake. It would rattle. But it would hold. The pilot might need both hands to pull out, but the Grumman-built frame wouldn't fold. The Zero was different. If a Japanese pilot tried to follow a heavy American plane into a 400 miles per hour dive, his controls would stiffen and freeze. The long, elegant wings that made the Zero deadly in a turn would become giant levers for the air to grab. The twisting forces at the tips would be catastrophic. The Japanese pilot, confident in his superior machine, would think he could follow the American tub anywhere. He would dive. He would accelerate. And when he tried to pull out for the shot, physics would tear his plane apart. It was a game of chicken played with the laws of aerodynamics. Training was brutal. Thach forced his men to practice power dives until their ears popped and their eyes felt like they were being shoved into the backs of their skulls. They climbed to 20,000 feet and dropped like stones, watching the altimeter unwind like a broken clock. They learned to trust the groan of metal. The Wildcat would shudder violently as it neared its limits, but it would not break. They braced their boots against the rudder pedals and hauled back on the stick at the last possible second. Leveling out just above the waves, vision grayed and hearts hammering. They were turning themselves into human cannonballs. The first real test came during a skirmish near the Coral Sea. For Wildcats were jumped by a flight of Zeros. The Japanese came in high and fast, expecting the usual turning fight. Instead, the American leader shouted, "Power dive!" All four Wildcats rolled inverted and plunged. The Zeros followed. At 15,000 feet, the chase began. By 10,000, the Wildcats were screaming past 300 miles per hour. By 5,000, they were pushing 400. The American planes shook violently, instrument panels blurring. Behind them, the Zeros began to suffer. Controls stiffened. Wings trembled under the crushing air. At 2,000 feet, the American leader barked, "Pull out!" The Wildcats groaned as their pilots hauled back. G-forces slammed them into their seats. Blood drained from their heads. Vision tunneled. But the stubby wings bit into the heavy air. The noses rose. The Wildcats leveled off just above the Whitecaps. The Zeros didn't. One wing folded upward with a sickening snap, tearing free. The aircraft spun into the ocean. Another Zero pulled too hard. Its control surfaces ripped away, and it cartwheeled into the sea. Back aboard the carrier, despair turned into something harder. Gritty, manic confidence. The pilots were no longer walking toward execution. They were walking toward their planes with a secret. They had a move now. It wasn't pretty. It hurt like hell. But it worked. Yet Thach knew this was only the beginning. The Japanese would adapt. And they weren't just sending patrols anymore. They were assembling an armada. Intelligence reports spoke of carriers, battleships, and hundreds of Zeros converging on a tiny island called Midway Atoll. On the morning of June 4th, the sky over Midway became a furnace of smoke, tracers, and screaming metal. Swarms of dive bombers and torpedo planes swept in under a protective canopy of Zeros. Thach and 6 Wildcats were all that stood between that swarm and the carrier USS Yorktown. The odds were absurd. He saw American torpedo squadrons being slaughtered below. Slow, exposed, butchered by Zeros. Thach knew he had to draw the wolves away. He shoved the throttle forward and led his division straight into the enemy. The Zeros peeled off instantly. They expected panic. They expected the Americans to break formation. Instead, Thach waited until they were fully committed, screaming down at full combat power, then shouted a single command, "Drop it!" 6 Wildcats rolled inverted and plunged. For a moment, the Japanese closed the gap. Tracers stitched the air. Then gravity took command. The heavy Wildcats accelerated like runaway freight trains. The airspeed needle swept past 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The air howled. The controls shook like jackhammers. Behind them, the Zeros were hitting a wall. Controls stiffened. Wings strained. At 4,000 feet, the air grew thick and punishing. Thach gripped the stick with both hands. Boots planted. Teeth clenched. He hauled back. The Wildcat groaned. The steel main spar flexed but held. 5GS crushed him into his seat. Vision grayed. The nose came up. The plane carved a brutal arc and leveled just above the waves. The lead Zero tried to follow. Its wing folded. The aircraft snapped into a spin and smashed into the ocean. Another pilot panicked. He pulled too hard, too low. Compressibility held him prisoner. His control surfaces failed. He plunged into the sea. The surviving Japanese broke off, stunned. Back in the ready room, the mood had changed forever. The Wildcat might have been a beer barrel, but if you roll a beer barrel down a hill, you don't stand in front of it. And as the Battle of Midway raged, Jimmy Thach tightened his harness and whispered to himself, "Let gravity do the work." He screamed past Thach's tail, unable to turn, unable to climb. He plowed straight into the sea at 400 miles per hour. The impact was absolute. The aircraft simply vanished in a white explosion of spray. The third Zero pilot managed to get his nose up. He fought the G-forces, his plane creaking and groaning as it bottomed out of the dive just feet above the water, his propeller kicking up sheets of spray. He had survived the fall, but he had forgotten the second half of the flying anvil trap. When a heavy object pulls out of a dive, it carries massive momentum. It has zoom energy. Thach didn't just level off. He converted speed back into altitude. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, heavy and fast, shot upward like a roller coaster car climbing out of a loop. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, light and drag-heavy, bled off speed during its pullout. Now it was low, slow, and struggling to climb. Thach looped over the top, trading velocity for height. He glanced down. The surviving Zero was wallowing just above the water, its pilot likely half-conscious or fighting to regain control. It was a sitting duck. Thach rolled inverted and came down from above. No turning duel. No fancy dogfight. He simply lined up the beer barrel on the wounded enemy and squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat's .50 caliber machine guns hammered. Heavy slugs tore through the Zero's unarmored cockpit and fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter burst into flames and cartwheeled into the sea. 3 Zeros, 3 kills, and Thach hadn't turned once. He hadn't tried to outfly them. He had simply dropped like a stone and let physics do the killing. But the sky was still crowded with enemies. Thach climbed back to 10,000 feet, his engine running hot, his ammunition counters dropping. He regrouped with his wingman, Edward Butch O'Hare's contemporary and fellow pilot, Ensign Mac Omer, name often rendered differently in accounts. They were 2 heavy Wildcats alone in a sky buzzing with angry bees. A fresh flight of 6 Zeros spotted them. This time, the Japanese were cautious. They didn't dive blindly. They coordinated, some attacking from above, others climbing from below, trying to box the Wildcats into a turning fight where Zero agility would dominate. This was the moment Thach had feared. You can't dive forever. Eventually, you run out of altitude. Thach looked at the 6 fighters closing in. He keyed his mic. "Mac, stay close. We're going to weave. No dive this time. A different geometry." He banked his Wildcat toward his wingman. Mac Omer banked toward him. They crossed paths like a pair of scissors. The Zeros chasing Thach thought they had him lined up. But as they pursued, they flew directly in front of Mac Omer's guns. Mac Omer fired. The Zeros broke hard, or died. Now one latched onto Mac Omer's tail. He turned back toward Thach. They crossed again. Thach fired. It was a deadly dance. The Thach Weave. They weren't turning to chase. They were turning to cover each other. The airspace between them became a floating kill zone. Every time a Zero tried to settle onto one tail, it exposed itself to the other Wildcat's guns. The Japanese pilots were baffled. They were used to lone opponents, pilots who panicked and maneuvered independently. They weren't prepared for 2 aircraft operating like a single machine. They attacked, broke off, attacked again. Each time they were met with converging fire. For nearly 20 minutes, two heavy Wildcats held off an entire squadron of elite fighters. They burned ammunition. They burned fuel. Sweat soaked their flight suits. The cockpit air smelled of cordite and hot oil. But they did not die. By the time the Japanese finally broke away, low on fuel and frustrated, Thach and Mac were still flying. Below them, oil slicks burned on the surface of the Pacific. They had proven something vital. The Wildcat wasn't a coffin. It was a tank. Could absorb punishment. Could fall like a meteor. And if flown with discipline instead of ego, it could kill anything in the sky. Thach turned his battered fighter back toward the burning silhouette of USS Yorktown. The carrier was wounded, smoke pouring skyward after repeated strikes during the Battle of Midway. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later, when Thach brought his Wildcat down onto the deck of the USS Enterprise, Yorktown was dying in the distance. He climbed from a cockpit that reeked of sweat, burned powder, and fear. The wings were riddled with bullet holes. The paint was scorched. Oil dripped from the engine onto the flight deck. But the plane was intact. Grumman Iron Works had held. He walked into the ready room. Silence met him. The other pilots had seen the swarm. They had seen the odds. They had assumed he was gone. Instead, he stood there calmly drinking coffee, explaining how he had just killed 3 Zeros by falling out of the sky. Word of the Thach Weave and the diving trap spread through the fleet faster than any rumor. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a lifeline. For months, American pilots had felt outmatched by the Zero. They had gone into combat feeling like targets. Now they had a method, playbook. They realized the tub wasn't slow. It was misunderstood. It was a rugged, armored, high-speed brick that could punish a lighter enemy, if you forced that enemy to fight on your terms. The experts had said the Wildcat was obsolete. Jimmy Thach proved it was simply waiting for the right mind behind the stick, and the courage to let it fall. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the war, and the Grumman F4F Wildcat was the shield that made it possible. While the dive bombers received the glory for sinking the Japanese carriers, the Wildcats held the line. They fought off swarms of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters that tried to intercept the American strikes. They protected the fleet, and they did it in an aircraft many experts had dismissed as obsolete. The early kill ratios had been grim, but after Midway they began to improve. It wasn't 10-1 yet, but it was climbing. For every Wildcat lost, a Zero often went down with it. More importantly, American pilots were surviving. That was the hidden genius of the heavy American design. When a Zero was hit, it frequently exploded. With little armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks, even a short burst of .50 caliber fire could turn it into a torch. The Wildcat was different. It was armored. It had self-sealing tanks. It absorbed punishment. Pilots came home in shredded machines. Half a wing torn up, rudder shot away, engines coughing on damaged cylinders. They would slam onto the carrier deck, catch a wire, and climb out alive. Mechanics patched the holes with sheet metal, painted over the scorch marks, and sent the same aircraft back into the air the next morning. The beer barrel was tough. It protected its pilot like a mother bear. Jimmy Thach's tactics became gospel across the Pacific. The Navy printed manuals explaining the Thach Weave. They drilled pilots in high-speed diving attacks. They stopped encouraging traditional dogfights and started teaching hit-and-run discipline. The culture shifted. American naval aviation moved away from romantic one-on-one duels and toward coordinated teamwork. 2 Wildcats flying a weave were lethal. A Wildcat in a dive was nearly untouchable. Pilots learned to respect weight. They learned to weaponize gravity. By 1943, the war had evolved again. The Navy introduced the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat looked like a Wildcat that had bulked up at the gym. Bigger, faster, powered by a 2,000 horsepower engine. Could climb with the Zero and outfight it in nearly every category. Yet it retained the Iron Works DNA, heavy, armored, brutally durable. When Hellcat pilots entered combat, they didn't need to invent new tactics. They used the principles Thach had refined. The weave, the dive, teamwork over ego. Only now they had an aircraft that amplified those advantages. In 1944, during the air battles over the Marianas, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a single day. The kill ratio soared toward 19-1. But that dominance rested on foundations laid in 1942 by the so-called tubs that had refused to break. The Hellcat became the sword. The Wildcat had been the shield. Jimmy Thach went on to become an admiral. He continued innovating, later developing layered fleet defenses against kamikaze attacks. Yet he never forgot the Wildcat. He never forgot sitting in that cramped cockpit, watching Zeros dive, realizing that survival depended on pushing the stick forward instead of pulling it back. He defended the beer barrel for the rest of his life. Without the Wildcat's toughness, he argued, many experienced American pilots, the men who would later train the next generation, would have died in 1942. The Zero destroyed airplanes. The Wildcat saved pilots. And in a long war, trained pilots are more valuable than machines. Japanese aviation doctrine largely refused to compromise on lightness and agility. Armor was rejected because it added weight. Maneuverability remained sacred. The sword had to stay sharp. Thousands of skilled pilots paid the price. Today, only a handful of flyable Wildcats remain. At air shows, they rumble past sleeker icons like the Mustang or the Corsair. They look small, a little tubby. People smile at the hand-cranked landing gear and the square-cut wings. They don't always realize they're looking at a legend. That squat, rugged fighter held the line against the most formidable naval air power on Earth at the time. It didn't win by being the fastest or the prettiest. It won by being durable enough, and by being flown by pilots willing to think differently. It demanded a specific kind of courage. The courage to look at a superior opponent and say, "You may be faster, you may be more graceful, but I'm heavier, and I will drag you into a fight you cannot survive." It embodied a particular way of war, pragmatic, industrial, relentless. So the next time you see a picture of that compact blue fighter, don't laugh. Remember Jimmy Thach. Remember the weave. Remember the sound of wind screaming over square wings at 400 miles per hour. Remember the Zeros folding because they tried to follow a falling anvil. In war and in life, you don't always need to be the fastest. Sometimes you just have to be the hardest thing to break.